Hey everyone, welcome to this crash course of MUI V5. In this video, we're going to talk about what MUI is, when you should use it, and how to pretty much go about using all the basic functionalities, and I'm going to touch on some of the cooler parts as well, just so you guys have an idea of what it is while you are using it. And this is pretty much made for the person that is thinking about integrating MUI with their React project, but is not quite sure how to piece everything together, or whether or not it is right for them, and how to use it and how to customize it. And if you're a MUI veteran, stay tuned because there are going to be some unique things that I talk about in this video that are new to MUI V5, which not a lot of other videos talk about. And as always, if you find value, make sure you subscribe and leave a comment. It helps so much with the channel. But first of all, let's talk about what MUI is. And by the way, everything I talk about will be used and linked in the description below. And if you have any questions about the actual in-depth of any of these MUI things, I have an entire playlist that I made over the last month of every single MUI component and how everything works in super depth. So you can always double check with the super in-depth videos afterwards. I chose to make this video last just so I would have that all prepared for you guys by the time you are watching this video. So MUI is essentially a UI library that was made after something called material design. And material design was sort of a design standard that people came up with for, cool looking websites and mobile apps and stuff like that. And essentially, they talk about things like how to style your typography, how to do the layout, how to scale your text and everything. And the people that made Material UI were like, hey, why don't we take all these design standards and turn it into a UI library for React? And that is exactly what they did. Essentially, Material UI is just a giant library with a bunch of reusable components that you can import into your React application. For example, here I have a basic button component, and you can see here they have a bunch of cool different buttons that you can use and different ways to customize them. And on the components part of their documentation, you can see that they have a ton of different components to choose from things as simple as buttons to as complex as autocomplete, things where you can type in, different things and have it autocomplete. And there are so many different components. I tried to do an entire video for every component, and you'll see that I have a ton of them on my channel. But essentially, let's look at how to actually install and get started with Material UI. And one of the cool things about Material UI is the fact that it's actually super customizable. So if you see how something looks on the documentation and it's not exactly what you're looking for, don't worry, we're going to talk about how to customize everything to have sort of, whatever certain look you are looking for, and as well as, if you're a part of an organization, how to customize that as well. So the three libraries you're going to need to get started are MUI Material, and then two external libraries called Emotion/React and Emotion/Styled. And if you're doing this and following along on VS Code or something, you can go into your React project and npm install these three libraries. I will be doing all the coding here in Code Sandbox. So I'm going to go ahead and find MUI Material. We're going to go ahead and find Emotion/Styled. And then the last one is Emotion/React. So we're going to go ahead and find Emotion/React as well. Now, the simplest way to get started once you have all three of these dependencies installed is just importing a component. So we're going to go ahead and import the button component, and that is going to come from MUI/Material. Now, if you look at any of the examples of all the different, components and stuff like that, for example, for this button, if you were to make it bigger, you'll see that they're importing it from MUI/button. You can pretty much for any component import it from the actual subfolder of the MUI component that you want to get it from. But a lot of the times in your components and your React projects, you're probably going to be importing more than one component, and it's just easier to sort of import it like this, where you just structure it from the actual folder. That way, if I wanted to import any other things like stack or typography, or any cool stuff like that, I don't have to make a new line every single time. I can just, add them over here. And I find that to be really helpful. And before, there used to be efficiency issues with that, but not anymore. Pretty much it's the same efficiency by doing this. So let me go ahead and get rid of all of this default stuff. And I'm going to go ahead and try using this button component right here. So we're going to say button and maybe type in, hello from MUI V5, and then, now we have a button, and you can see if I click on it, it doesn't look that much like a button. So let's see what we can do about that. So we can see here there are a couple of different examples. So for example, the first thing we see are sort of this variant prop that you can pass in, and this variant prop allows you to change it from looking like the default button, which is called a text button, which is just how we have it, to maybe having one that looks a bit more like a button because it's contained, or a bit more because it's like outlined and stuff like that. So let's go and like play around with that. So maybe we'll pass in a variant and maybe make it a contain variant. Oops. And there we go. By passing in this prop, we're able to change the actual look of the component itself. And you might be wondering, okay, how do we know what props there are? And what are the other props and stuff like that? And the answer to that is, number one, each component will have 2 sections of it in the documentation. The first one is going to be the example section of it, where you can see here they sort of give examples of the different props you can pass in and all the different values for those props. So for example, like the size prop is one of them, and if you click this little expander bar to see the code, you can see that you can pass in like size small, size medium, size large to change the size. But if you want to get a complete idea, if you scroll all the way to the bottom, they will have a section where you can find links to the APIs for each of those components. So for example, for the button API, you can see all these different props that you can pass in, and here's your the variant prop we just used, and the size prop we just talked about. It'll show you what the default is and all the values you can pass in, and then at the end the type. For example, size, you're passing in a string with either small, medium, or large. And the important thing to note about these props is that each component will have around 3 props that are similar to all of them. So the first one is just going to be children, which is sort of just, you don't really have to worry about that. That's just like whatever you pass in to the component nested inside of it. So in this case, we just passed in some text and it displayed that text. And a lot of times you can do some cool customizable things like, passing in like entire like JSX, code and stuff like that. Like maybe we could pass in like a whole, I don't know, table if we wanted to. I don't know why you would ever want to do that, but it's probably possible to do that. And the other things you could, they will also have is this classes object. And the classes object is used to sort of overwrite some stylings and style it, and we'll talk about that in a bit. And also something called the SX prop. And the SX prop is new to this version of Material UI, and it's very helpful. And I have a whole video on the SX prop, which I will link next in the actual playlist itself. But essentially, we'll talk about in a bit. But just know that every single Material UI component has this SX prop, and it's very important and very useful. So let's go back over to our example, and let's try adding some more Material UI components, some maybe simple ones, and start building out something just with Material UI. So typography is another very, very important default thing that you will use a lot. Essentially, typography is going to be whatever you wrap your text into. So when you're using Material UI, you're not going to use like H1, H2 tags or like paragraph tags. Every single piece of text should be wrapped in typography, and that typography you can add in custom variants to make it look like all of those default HTML stuff. So for example, if we like maybe have, let's go ahead and import typography. We can go ahead and make some typography and like maybe, say, this is my app. And you'll see by default, the text is pretty small. But if we go to back to the typography documentation, you can see that there are a bunch of different things you can pass in. So let's go to the API, and you can see you can pass in this variant prop over here. And this variant prop, you can pass in, by default, it's body1, which is equivalent to just think regular paragraph tags. And in the type system, you can actually see what they all equate to as well. So for example, body1, you'll see the font is Roboto. Let me zoom in a bit. The font is Roboto, the size is 16 pixels and stuff like that. You can also see all of this over here as well. But essentially, let's go ahead and change the variant to this to something like maybe H1. Let's make it like as big as it can possibly be. And let's pass in the H1 variant, and bam! Now we got some big text on the screen. And this is, really useful because a lot of the times, if you wanted to set a standard, like, maybe stylings for all the H1s in your application, you are able to do that by editing the typography variants. And I'll show you how to do that in just a second. Let's set this to H6 so it's not as, big. And or maybe an H4. And you can see here, you know, I can also like go ahead and, you know, maybe make another typography under that. That's like, you know, maybe just the default body that says like, you know, something like, I hope you find value, hit the like button or something. Maybe let's just change that to, you know, like hit the like button so it's not messing up our code with how long that typography is. So now you might be wondering, okay, where is it getting this default text from? Where does the button get this like weird default blue from? And that leads us into this sort of second paragon of Material UI. So far we've talked about just how to import components, you know, style them, or sorry, not style them, but like change them up based on the props to make them look a bit different depending on what you might need. And you can sort of see that when you build a Material UI, you're just building a regular React application and you're using this as like the sort of as default components, you know, instead of just regular HTML components. And there are a ton of things like you can even have like whole tables and stuff like that, where your entire table, you know, is essentially like, you know, from Material UI and stuff like that. So hopefully it's replacing almost everything you would need on a website, which is what they tried to do. But now let's talk about the second really important part of Material UI, and that essentially is the idea of customizing a theme. So a lot of times, if you're doing Material UI, you might want things to look a specific way or have a specific theme in mind. So for example, I don't want all my default button colors to look blue. There is a way to change, and I don't want maybe my text to look like this or have this typography or have this size and stuff like that for all my H1s. And the example I like to use is I worked for a pretty big enterprise company, and I led the team where we actually had to create an entire design system of internal components. And what we actually did was I told the developer I was going to be using Material UI as the base of everything. So they downloaded the Material UI Figma pack, and Figma is a UX tool to create UX designs. And they designed it and modified it to look like the company's design standards, but it sort of had the shape and feel of Material UI components. What I was able to do was customize an entire theme and customize every single component and make my own component out of it that had its own look and feel. And the main way you do this, and one of the biggest things you have to use to do this, is something called the theme. So everything in Material UI has a default theme. So for example, if we go back to this button API and we look at the color, you can see that there are a couple of different values we can pass in, and by default it's this weird value called primary. And what I can do is I can go ahead and maybe change that to secondary. So let's go to the button and change color equal to secondary. And you'll see it now changed it from this blue to this sort of like purpley color. And if I go back to that and I actually change it to like maybe success or error or info, you know, for example, success is this green, info is this like other blue, error is going to be this reddish color. You might be wondering, where is it getting all of these random colors from? And the answer to that is the theme. By default, every component comes with a theme built into it, and unless you override it, it will pretty much stick to that theme. So the default theme object, you can actually find it on their documentation, and it looks like this. It has a whole bunch of different cool values. For example, a breakpoint object, and if you look at Material UI, a lot of it is going to be very responsive by default, and the way that works is through something called breakpoints. Whenever it detects that the screen is at a certain size, it will modify the CSS of their components by default to sort of make it look proper, so that it doesn't, you know, get cut off or anything like that. So that is what this breakpoints object does. And you know, you can define, you know, for example, their extra large breakpoint is anything that's above 1500 pixels width, and you can like go ahead and change all of that. But out of all of these different things you can modify in the theme, and I have a whole theme video if you want to go in depth, but for now we're going to focus mostly on maybe the palette, because the palette is going to be the most common thing you are going to edit. So for example, in this palette you can see there is a bunch of different things, but I want to specifically focus on this primary and secondary color. If we go ahead and open it, we can see this is where our blue, whenever we set the color to default or to primary, we are getting this blue color, and whenever we change it to secondary, we're getting this purple color. This is where all of that lives, and we're going to talk about right now how to overwrite that. So the first thing you want to do whenever you create a new theme is you're going to want to create it as high up as possible in your React tree. So For example, that high up would probably be in your index.js where you're actually calling the rest of your application. And the reason for this is anything that is not, wrapped around this theme provider tag, which I'm going to show you in a second, will not get the new theme. And you can also, if you wanted to have specific themes for just small parts of different applications, you can also do that as well and nest themes inside of each other. But that gets, a bit crazy and stuff like that. Just for this, crash course, we're going to follow the simple case. So the first thing you're going to have to do is you're going to want to import theme provider and create theme from your material library. And then the next thing you're going to want to do is you're going to call that create theme. And essentially, you're just going to call it with an object. And that object is going to be everything you want to actually overwrite. So you can see here, the first thing we're going to want to do is within that palette object from the default theme, we are this object right here, this palette object. We want to just overwrite the primary color. And let's say I just want to overwrite the primary color, and by default, everything is going to use main. I'm just going to overwrite it so that the main is actually this sort of grayish color instead of that bluish color. So I'm just going to write palette, and then I'm going to nest primary inside of it, and I'm going to change main to be hashtag CCC, which is the only hex code I've ever memorized because it's gray. It's easy to remember. And then finally, all we're going to do is we're going to wrap our application around a theme provider tags and pass in the theme just like this. And essentially, that is all you need to do to overwrite the most basic, theme that you could possibly overwrite. So now we're going to come back here, and this color from error, we're going to change it back to primary. And bam, now our button has sort of this gray color to pull from. And I can actually delete this because the default is primary, so we don't actually have to explicitly say primary. But let's also, maybe make the secondary color like another color as well. The cool thing is Material UI actually comes built in with some colors. So for example, if I were to come back to the create theme page, so let's go to their theme customization. Let's see, are they pulling any color here? So let's see, theme provider. So we can actually see, whoops. They actually, here we go. So they actually have a subfolder called colors where you can pull a bunch of different colors from. So, if we wanted to maybe pull like a specific orange for our secondary color, we can go ahead and pull that. And then all we would have to do is set it equal so that, maybe let's come back. Secondary, I believe we can do like main is just equal to this orange. And now let's change our button color from primary to secondary. Whoops. Oh yeah, and let's give it a hue out of there as well. And if we come back and change the actual color to secondary, bam! Now it is pulling from this orangey color. So if you wanted to, like for example, just pull from some of their default colors and stuff like that, that is how you would do it as well. Or you can just define, hex colors and stuff like that. Now let's talk about how we can use the theme to customize our actual typography and stuff like that. And we have a whole example of this in our actual theming video, but I'm going to just quickly talk about that as well. But essentially, I'm going to pull from the example here. If you wanted to, for example, create a new variant. So, for typography, we can have like H1, H2, H3. And if we come back to it, you can see like H1, H2, H3, H4, H5, H6. We can have subtitles, captions, body 1, body 2. Let's say we wanted to create our own custom variant for our typography. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to define it. And what we can do is we can actually define it in the actual theme itself. So we're going to come back over here. And by the way, this code is going to be available in the description as well. And what we can do is we can just say we're going to overwrite something in the typography object, and we're going to create a new variant called my variant. And we're going to make the font size of that, I don't know, like maybe like 6 rem. We'll make it really big so it's really easy to tell. Now, if we go back to our app where we have that typography, we can see that we named it my variant. I can just go ahead, and this was not possible in previous versions of Material UI, but now it is, which is really cool. I can just go ahead and pass in the variant, my variant, and all of a sudden, whatever I define in there, it'll actually pull there. So I can even do something like set the default color of that text to like that orange 500. And now by default, it should at least change the text color to that orangey text color. So I can create different variants for all these different parts of my site. Let's say, for example, there's a standard error message the user might get every time they input wrong information. I can just create a variant for that error message, and then wherever that error message might have to pop up, I can just pass in the typography with that specific variant. And this is really important because as you create a whole application, you're ideally never going to want to have any text that it does not have a specific variant. And the reason for that is because you are going to, if you ever have to change it, and I had a big problem with this in that company I talked about before, we wanted to just change one aspect of all the typographies. So we wanted to scale them down a tiny bit. If you didn't use the typography prop or you didn't pass in a variance properly, you would have to manually go into every single typography and scale that text size down. But because we had it all centralized in one place where we had all the stylings, we were able to just, you know, set the font size from whatever it was to like a slightly smaller size, and that allowed it so that everything scaled at the same time, and you never have to worry about, you know, going through your entire application and doing everything one by one by one. So using, you know, theme variables is very, very important, and they don't just have things for colors and fonts, they also have default spacings and stuff like that as well. And if we go back to the default theme, you can see, like, for example, this doesn't give too much information, but there are default spacings, and by default, everything in Mertil UI works off of 4 pixel spacings. And to show you guys that, I'm going to talk about the next thing, which is styling your components. So a lot of the times, you know, there are going to be things that you can't edit just from the theme itself, and you're going to have to use stylings, specific stylings, especially when you're dealing with like divs and stuff like that. So if you're familiar with just basic React, you can pass in this prop called style, and you can, you know, change things like color of anything, and, you know, it'll pass it into just a standard HTML component, and, you know, you can pass them some styles inline. Well, Mertil UI V5 also has a way of inline styling its components, and it's a lot easier and a lot better to use than that style prop, and it is called the SX prop. And the SX prop is very, very useful because it allows you to pull from things that are default in Mertil UI. So if I were to come to the SX prop, you can see, for example, and let me find a really good example here. A lot of the times, like for example, this SX prop, which like I mentioned before, you can pass into any Mertil UI component, will allow you to just pass in inline styles. And the inline styles also have sort of shorthand. So for example, you can see in this specific example, they're passing in this thing called P, and they're just setting it to a value of 2. So let's go ahead and see what happens if I do that for maybe my button. So I'm going to pass in the SX prop, and I'm going to put P to 2. Now, if you didn't catch that, I'll go ahead and redo that. All it did was add a bit of padding to the actual button itself. And essentially, what these shorthands do is they have a bunch of different shorthands. P stands for padding, M stands for margin, and this value that you pass in is actually multiplied by the default spacing of the theme. So in the theme, by default, your spacing value is going to be equal to 4 pixels. If I pass in 2, it will make the padding equal to 2 times 4, which is going to be 8 pixels. So you can see here, it added 8 pixels of padding. If I were to make it 10, it would add 40 pixels of padding to the application. And the reason this is important, because that same company I talked about, we also had to scale down the padding of everything. And because whenever we used, we never did anything like, you know, padding like 10, 30 pixels or anything like that. We always, you know, if we had to, we did padding like maybe, if we wanted, you know, maybe like 16 pixels, we would pass on 4, because 4 times 4 is 16. Because of that, if you ever needed to scale your entire application down, you could just go over here and change the actual spacing value to something less or more, depending on whether you want to scale up or down the default look of your site. And that is, I can't, you know, it sounds pretty useless when you're first learning about Mertil UI, but just even knowing that that is possible, so that when you style things, you always use the actual theme spacing instead of, you know, random pixel values for everything, it could save you so much time in the future, especially if you're making a bigger application. Yeah, pretty much that is a really good way to style things. And if we go, you know, maybe to the to the SX prop, or maybe like they probably have it under like the styling guide and stuff like that. Let's see if we can find it. There's actually a whole place where they show you every single shorthand. So let me see if I can just find that really quick. Alright, so they sort of make it a bit hard to find, but you can see here that there's a properties reference table, and over here is where you can see sort of all the different properties you can pass in with like special values that you can access, like the theme and stuff like that. For example, if you wanted to pass in margin, you could use this M thing, and it correlates to like the margin in standard CSS and stuff like that. And MT, is a shorthand for margin top, which correlates to the margin top. And the value that it gets multiplied by is the spacing value of the actual theme itself, which by default is just 4 pixels. So you can do P and then, have it to 4 and stuff like that, and that will essentially allow you to do it as well. But let's go back to theming, and the other cool thing I want to talk about theming is how to use custom colors in theming. So let's say, for example, we make a custom color, and I'm just going to copy the example I have from my theming video. So in the palette, I'm going to add a custom color, and let's just call it my custom color. And I have like I'm importing red. You can see here I have the main set to 400, but I also have different variants. I have this like super dark variant and this super light variant. Well, if we wanted to access that, we could actually use the SX prop. So let's go to maybe this like typography over here, and we can pass in the SX prop, and then all we have to do after we pass in the SX prop is we can just set the color. So, and that's the other cool thing about the SX prop, is that it can read from theme variables. We can set the color equal to whatever my variant name was, so like my custom color. And if we were to go ahead and save that, let's see what would happen. You can see that nothing really happens because we didn't specify sort of the subcolor here. So if I were to then go to my custom color.main, you would see here it changes it to that main color. And if we change it to like maybe super dark, it would change it to the slightly darker version of it. And if we change it to super light, it would change it to the slightly lighter version of it as well. And that is pretty much like the easiest way to do like one-off stylings and stuff like that, as well as theme stuff for your actual components as well. Now let's talk about how you can do sort of like JSS stylings and stuff like that. So the sad thing is, they sort of by default deprecated using JSS stylings and stuff like that, which was sort of the standard of using Material UI, and instead they want you to use styled components. So we're going to quickly go over an example of both of them for you guys. I personally prefer, and I still use, even though it's deprecated, I still use the styled version of it. But let's go ahead and, for example, go to make styles, which you might not even be able to find in the documentation. But if I were to come over here into this demo, so we can come here, and the first thing we're going to go over is actually how to use their styled component. So the styled component, essentially you're going to have to import this styled prop from Material UI styles. So let's go ahead and import styled component from MUI/material/style. Once we import that, we can go ahead and choose whatever component we are trying to style. And this is really good if, like, for example, let's before we, made our button look like a mutant, let's change it back to what it looked like before. What we can go ahead and do is, let's say I really wanted to make this button custom and I wanted to look like a certain way. And, I might reuse this button component in other components and stuff like that. What we can do essentially is go ahead and use their styled method of doing it. So the simplest way to do that is just create a new component for it. And the way you do that is like, say, my custom button. We can then go ahead and, pass in styled and pass in the component we're actually trying to overwrite. And then over here, we can add our own styles, like padding, like, 10 or whatever. And then we just have to replace our regular button with that button. And if we go ahead and refresh, we will see that the new button, we'll see that the new button will also have these styles that we pass in. So you can then go ahead and like export this and stuff like that. We'll wait for code timers to catch up, and there you go. You can see that, it is going and adding that in. Now, the thing I don't really like about this, is the idea that like you can't use these same shorthands that you like had before and stuff like that. And I don't believe that when you pass in a value here, like if I were to pass in 2, you can see that it doesn't use the actual theme variables. So if you wanted to use theme, I believe you would have to like do something like this. And then pass in like theme dot spacing, and then pass in like 2. Oh, whoops, we were just missing the squigglies around theme to destructure it. But essentially, you can see here that now I have theme dot spacing 2, and as always, we can go into the theme and we can change spacing to like 1 pixels or whatever if we wanted to change it from 2 times 4 to 2 times 1. So you can see here, if I overwrote that, it would pretty much change the theming. But that is pretty much it for this crash course in Material UI. We talked about what Material UI is, when you should pretty much use it, why it's useful, and how to customize it, how to do the basic things like adding different components, how to style your components in 2 different ways. So we have this styled variation and also the SX prop, and you know, how to create your own custom themes and give it your own look. And Material UI goes so much deeper than that, and that's why I have over a 30 video series on Material UI that you can also check out. Before this, I did a different 30 video series on Material UI, but that was for the old version, so a lot of it's not applicable anymore. And if you found value, I'd really appreciate if you left a comment and subscribed and liked the video. It helps so much with the algorithm, and I'll see you guys in the next video.